Hello and welcome to the Django Celery Mastery course. Just a quick reminder, if you like this course and would like to access the source code and more, you can access this course on Udemy. The link to the course, which should provide the best price, is in the video description. We're going to start off by preparing a Docker working environment for Django, so building a Django container. Now, if you are already familiar with Docker and you feel comfortable doing this, then do please skip this step. You will find the code base in pretty much each section of this course. So just go ahead, copy and paste the setup, or create your own setup, of course, and then move to the next section. So as a quick reminder, before we start this, you are going to need to have Python installed and Docker desktop. Now, this should be a quite straightforward process. I have left some guides at the start of this course for you to follow. Again, just to reiterate, if you are familiar with Docker and Django, the scripts for what we're developing in this tutorial is available in this course sections resource. I am making the assumption you know what Python and Docker desktop is, although I will take you through some of the preliminaries as if you are new to Docker. Right, so let's make sure that Docker has been installed, Docker desktop. This is what you should look like, or something similar. It may look slightly different depending on what version you have. If it's a much later version than when I recorded, then it's probably going to look slightly different, but the dynamics and the features are probably going to be the same. In this course, I'm going to be utilizing Visual Studio Code, which I'm kind of making the assumption again that you're familiar with. Now, again, I probably have provided a setup guide for this at the start of the course, as well as giving you a little bit of an overview on how to start utilizing it. So please utilize that if you are new to Visual Studio Code and you want to follow along step by step. So first thing is to make a project folder and then open up File, Open Folder. I won't go through that process, but open a new folder, go to the folder where you are going to be saving your project, open that folder, you should be presented with this screen. Right, so next thing you're going to need to know is how to open up the terminal. We're going to be utilizing that a lot. So you can just up the top here, which you cannot see. I realize that. If you go over to View, the View option in the list here, you can then drop down to the terminal item here. And you can see there is a shortcut on Mac here, but there will be a shortcut on Windows as well. So you can use the shortcut rather than go into there to open and close the terminal. So I can just use the shortcut. Right, so that's the terminal. So now we need to create a virtual environment. Again, I have created some guides for you if you're not familiar with that. So let's go ahead. Again, I'm working on the Mac. To apologize if you are on a different operating system. So whether you're on Mac or Windows, you can probably type in Python 3, use the M flag and venv. So that's going to create a new virtual environment. Like I said, there should be a guide for your operating system at the start of this course. And then on the Mac, I'm going to type in source venv bin activate. That's going to then activate and then allow me to go into the virtual environment so I can start building. Now, if you're on Windows, you're going to just type in venv / and then I think scripts / and then activate. You can use tab. So here I just type in A, then press tab. It will then complete the command. Right, so now you can see venv. I'm in the virtual environment. So I press Control K to clear. If you're on Windows, you can type CLS to clear the screen. Apologies, to clear the terminal, not the screen, the terminal. Okay. So let's go ahead and install Django. So pip install Django. So that's going to install Django from the Python package index. I'm going to press Command K again to clear that. Right, so with that done, let's first of all set up pip requirements. Yeah, we'll do it here. No, we're not going to do it there. So let's create our Django project first, and then we'll create the pip requirement. So Django admin, let's start a new project. Let's call this project Celery. So Django Celery. So that's what we're going to call a project. You can call it whatever you like. This is just a demo project, if you like, for us to start to explore some of these Celery functions and features. So let's start a new project. Notice I didn't use the dot at the end to note where I wanted to save the project. So that has created a new folder called Celery. And inside of that, we have the project folder Celery with the settings. So that's my setup there. So I'm going to cd into that. Yeah, I'm going to cd into that, change directory. Celery, if you're not familiar with that. So move into there, and then I'm going to pip freeze the requirements, create requirements text. So there we have the requirements, which are going to be needed when we create a new Docker container or Docker image. Now, what we're going to do here is to install some other dependencies that are going to be needed. So we're going to pip install Celery. And then in addition to that, we'll also go ahead and pip install Redis. There we go. So we just run pressing up on the keyboard, just going to run the requirements again, just to update the requirements. And that should include now all the dependencies that are required to run Django, Redis, and Celery. I will also be making a commands file here, which you can access by downloading the code in this course. So you'll be able to check out some of the commands that I've utilized. I will start to copy and paste some of those commands that I've been utilizing in case you forget or you want to make some notes to save you having to kind of rewind and find when I use the commands. So I will be saving this to source control. So I will go ahead and create a git ignore file. And inside of here, we just want to ignore the vemp folder. And then in addition to that, we probably also want to, actually, I've got a list here. I just found my list. There we go. So those are just a few things that I'm going to ignore for source control reasons. I'm not going to save that in source control. If you're not using source control, just ignore that. Don't worry. Okay, so we're going to be utilizing Docker. So let's go back to Docker here. Now, just very briefly, images and containers. So very briefly then, if you're not familiar with images and containers, in the context of Docker, an image is a lightweight, or standalone, and executable package that encapsulates everything that we need to run a piece of software. This includes the code, the runtime environment, the system tools, and libraries. So very much like an operating system, if you like, in that we can grab everything that we need to then run a container. Let's think of a container as a unit, an individual unit on our computer that we can then run applications and other things like we do with our main operating system. But of course, we're sharing the resources of our computer with the container. Now, this image that we're going to be downloading serves as the template or blueprint for creating our Docker containers. So what we're going to need then is this image to create the blueprint for creating our container. And then we're going to provide the instructions in a Docker file, which is going to specify the configuration and dependencies of the software application that's going to be needed to run in the container. That doesn't make sense. Hopefully it will do in a second. So what we're going to need to do here then is we're going to need to describe or build a Docker Compose. So we're going to be utilizing Docker Compose because we're going to be building a few different services. So Docker Compose files is going to allow us to describe multiple services that we're going to build for our working environment so we can start to use Celery. So inside of here, first of all, we're going to describe, like I said, the services that we're going to create. So here at the top, we can describe the version code that we're going to be utilizing here in Docker. So that's going to be 3.8. Now, all of this is available for you to view if you're interested in Docker and you're new to Docker. Have a look at Docker Compose documentation. That's going to give you a much deeper view if you're interested in the code that we're using. But I'll provide you a general overview. We will run this line by line. I'm not entirely sure why I called it MD. Apologies. I was thinking about something else at the time. It's going to be a YAML file. Okay, notice that the Docker icon appears on the left-hand side of it to indicate the fact that it is a Docker Compose file. Right, so we need to be careful here because we need to make sure that we're providing the correct spaces between the code. So services. So I have gone ahead and indented this by 1, so service. So the first service that we're going to be building then is going to be Django. So we can call this web. I'm going to call this Django, this service. And then I'm going to indent again, sorry. And then I'm going to give this container a name. And that's going to make it easy for us to actually then navigate into it. You'll see that shortly. We can hook into our container and view the terminal or use the terminal inside the container so that we can provide additional instructions like we would do, for example, if we were running Django on our computer. So I'm going to name the container Django so we can easily access it. And then I'm going to describe the build. Right, so we're going to need to provide, like I said, some additional instructions so that we can build, we're going to context, so that we can build our Django application inside of our container. So here, I'm going to call this Celery. So this is referring to this directory folder, this top level directory folder here, dot this folder directory, and then slash. So slash dcelery, so that's going to be this folder here. So inside of this folder, I'm expecting it to be able to find the Docker file. So I'm going to add a Docker file here. I'm going to add a Docker file there. So that's my Docker file. This is going to describe shortly, actually, how to set up the Django environment. Right, so we'll do that in a second. Apologies. Not too sure why I made a capital there. Okay, so that's lowercase. Right, so that's a Docker file. Now, we can specify that here. So we could say, for example, Docker file and then the name of the Docker file, because we don't have to call it Docker file. But because we have called it Docker file, Docker will look for that file first, so we don't need to do that. So that's the build. That's the build settings. Let's bring this down so we can see what we're doing. Okay, so we'll describe that or sort that out in a minute. So if we work through the workflow at the moment, what we've got is we've told Docker where to find the instructions to kind of load up everything that's needed to run Django in the container. So once that's done, we then create a new command so that we can then start Django in the container. So this is a command that we're going to use in the container, run server, and then that's going to be 0.0.0.0 and then colon 8000. So that's going to run Django in the container. Hopefully you're with me so far if you are new. And then what we need to do, right, so this is kind of the tricky bit. We are skipping many different lessons on Docker here. But what we're going to need to do is, let's remember, try to visualize this. Eventually we're going to have a container here, and that's going to be running a live version of our Django application. So let's imagine that a container is an operating system, a computer. On that computer there's an operating system, and that's running Django. So we're configuring that to be available. We're configuring that to run Django. Now, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to make sure the code in that container is up to date and is running the current code that we want to run, correlating to our Django application. And we want to manage that code within our Visual Studio Code platform here. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a volume, which is going to mount this local directory where our app directory is inside the container. So we're going to essentially create a copy of this code inside of the container, but we're going to link it up so that whenever we make changes here in our local machine, it will update the code inside of the container. Remember, the container is like a computer running our instance of Django. Let's not forget that. So here we're just going to, in our local machine, we're just going to edit the code. We're going to manage starting and stopping the server on the container. So what we need to do here is just tell Docker about the volumes, the fact that we want to mount this local directory into the container. So let's call this volumes. And then we need to specify. So here we can use the dash. So I have tabbed there, dash d slash, dot slash. Now we just need to remember that this is a Docker compose file. This is where it currently resides. So dot slash. And then we just need to describe what folder we want to, mount to the container. And it's this folder here, this dcelery folder. This has everything in related to Django. So dcelery, and then we needed to then describe on the container where we want to mount it to. So in this case, it's going to be user /, if you're familiar with Linux, this potentially is going to make sense. This is the folder structure inside of the image that we're going to be utilizing. So inside of here, we have a folder called app. So that's where we're going to store our Django application in the container. So we're going to copy our folder here over to this folder there. Right, so we are going to need to be able to access our container. So I'm going to set up the ports here. I'm going to set port 8001 on my local machine. So I'm going to be able to access my container from my local machine from my browser. So I need to type in 8001 port, and I'm going to map that across to port 8000 on the container. And that, of course, is where Django is running. So I'm just mapping that across so that when I run this in my browser, it's going to map across to 8000 in the container and thus show me Django. Right, so we're also going to need some environment variables. So going to set up some environment variables for our application. This isn't necessary, but while you're here, we might as well add them. So debug equals 1. Now you will find I will probably added some comments if you were to download this to give you a better idea of what we're doing here. So secret key equals, and then we just need to generate a secret key for Django, whatever you like for now. We could also obviously make Django do that, but that's going to be fine for now. So we're going to set the allowed host. That's going to equal local host maybe, and then 127.0.0.1. So that's what the hosts are going to be allowed to connect. Okay. So let's go for. Okay, I think that's it. I think that's all we need to do there. So we've set up some environment variables. So that's pretty much it for our Django container in terms of setting up so that we can run the Django application inside of the container. We've mapped across the folder so that we can work here in Visual Studio Code, but update the code in the container. And then we set some environment variables. So we are going to need to, of course, define these environment variables within our application. So let's go into the main settings here. Let's go to the top. I'm just going to remove some of this code here. These comments, sorry. For now. So we need to get rid of the secret key and then debug. And then we're going to set the allowed hosts. Okay. Okay, so we're going to need to access these environment variables in the container. So we are going to set them in the container. So we need to access them through os environ get. So that would be the same on all of these here. So we can just copy and paste that down. You see that we're going to need to import os. So that gives us access to the operating system file system, for example, and other OS features. So here we're going to need to describe what we want to access. So in this case, the secret key, that's going to be the secret key inside of, we're just describing what we've got here. So secret key, we've got debug. So this is going to be debug and then the allowed host. I'll just copy and paste that in there. So that's what we want to access. So that's going to be accessed from the environment variables. Now we have specified multiple environment variables for the allowed hosts. So in actual fact here, we're going to need to define split, just to split the configuration based upon the commas there. So we're just simply taking out, extracting all of these different options there so that we can apply them correctly to the allowed hosts. Okay, so that's Django now set up. So let's go back into we're going to need the Docker file now. So let's go back into Docker file. We need to specify some of those settings. So at the moment, we've got some general instructions for the container so that we can run command in the container once everything's been built or when the container started. We know to map across our folder here. We know to access the container and we know to set some environment variables. So now we need to actually get our project over to the container. So if we go into the Docker file here that we created inside of the outer or inside of our main Celery folder here, let's go ahead now and just define what we need here. So first of all, we need an image. Now remember what I said, the image is like a blueprint of everything that's needed to then run our application. So here we're going to use 3.11. Now this might change, obviously, depending on how old this tutorial becomes. So as a recording, 3.11.4 Alpine. So this is a Docker image, a pre-created Docker image, which has a copy of Alpine, or should I say Alpine Linux. So this is a lightweight and minimalistic Linux distribution that is very commonly used as a based image for Docker containers. So Alpine Linux is known for its small size and focus on security, and it makes it simply an ideal choice for containerized environments. So do be sure that you select Alpine if you want to follow along step by step, because these different versions which you can utilize will have different Linux versions, will have different features. So some may work, some may not, based upon the settings that we apply going through this project. So do be careful if you do want to follow along step by step, you've utilized the same versions. Now, I can't guarantee that I'll be able to keep this tutorial up to date, so it is also important to have a look at the requirements as well, and just to make sure you are utilizing the same here. And then if you do want to explore later versions, then please just update them individually. I cannot always guarantee, of course, that the features and what we set here in this course will work on the newer features of any of these different packages. Okay, so that's our Linux version, if you like. We're going to be utilizing Alpine. So let's go for our work directory. So we're going to set our work directory here. Remember, that's the working directory inside of the container. So that's going to be the app here. That's what we defined earlier. And then we're going to need to set up some, we don't have to, but typically we set up 2 different parameters. And I'm just going to bring them in because I've got a setup file here that typically use. So here, first of all, we're going to set Python don't write bytecode 1, which is going to prevent Python from writing any PYC files. And then we're just going to ensure the output is sent directly to the terminal without buffering. So we get all the output to the terminal, setting Python unbuffered 1. Right, so those are 2 kind of common settings that are normally set. So what we need to do now is, now pretend what we're doing now is we're building the image. And we're setting everything inside of that image before we then build our container. So what we want to do is we want to pip install. We can do an upgrade. Let's just make sure that we're using the latest version of pip. And then we're going to go ahead and copy the requirements file. So /requirements.txt. Now let's just remember where this is. So remember dot referring to this directory / and then the name of the file. So we're here in this Docker file. So that's where we find the requirements file. So that's right. It's text. And then what we want to do is we want to copy it over to our working directory. So src/app. So once that's over there. Okay. So once that's over there, it's so simple to spell that wrong. Once that's over there, we're going to then go ahead and run that. So we're going to run pip install and then use the R flag, because we want to run from requirements.txt. So we're going to run all of that. We're going to run the requirements file and install all the dependencies that are described in our requirements text file. Right, so that's next step. And then what we want to do then is to copy. Right, so we're going to create an entry point file. This entry point file is going to be run every time we run the container. So these are typical tasks that we might want to run when the container starts. For example, in our case, in Django, we want to maybe collect static files or maybe run a migrate. So I'll just quickly show you this because this can be a fairly good thing to know when working with Django and Docker. Right, so let's go ahead and add this file in. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this entry point. It's going to be a sh file. Okay, and then at the top here, we're going to have the shebang. There we go. Now this is important. Okay, so if you weren't running, apologies, let me zoom out. If we weren't running Alpine, potentially we would have the bash shell available in that particular version of Linux that we're running in our container. Now, because we're using Alpine, we need to remember that that runs the ash shell. So we need to specify the ash shell here. Of course, if you're not familiar to this format here, this is known as the shebang or hash bang line in the Unix-like operating systems, Linux, for example. So this is a special comment placed at the beginning of the script to indicate that the interpreter, to indicate the interpreter that should be used to execute the script. I got it out there. Okay, so we've got that in place. Now we just need to specify what we want to run. So here, just for an example, let's go ahead and we can echo out something. Let's echo out like apply database migrations. If we wanted that, for example, in the terminal maybe, and then we can run Python manage.py and then migrate. So that's just going to run, like I said, every time the container starts. And then we can execute the provided commands or empty point. So we can type in and then $, come on, can't find my keys. There we go. So here in this shell script that we're developing, this command here is used to execute the command or entry point provided to the script. So it's common practice to include this line at the end of a script that is meant to serve as an entry point or execute a specific command. So this is going to be run on our container. So we need to specify that. So we're going to need to copy that across first. So let's do that. Now, why we are copying this across? Because from memory, this will not be copied across, because in a minute we're going to copy the whole project across to our server, but I believe that would not copy this shell script. It would simply not include it. So we have to do this manually. Now there is something else that we need to potentially think about here, which might not work. And that's to think about, again, on Linux or Mac, if you're following on Linux or Mac, this could be the case. So what we might need to do in addition, what we might need to do is to ensure that this file, the entry point file, has been set to the right permissions. So it's just well worth going into your terminal here. I'm going to type in chmod. Again, here on the Mac, you probably won't need to do this on Windows. I'm just going to set that to +X here, and that's going to ensure that we can then access it on the server. So you can just go ahead and run that if you're on Mac or potentially Linux. Now, do make sure that you're in the right directory to do that. Of course, I was in the directory where the entry point file is currently being stored. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do then is go ahead and now just copy the whole project over to our working directory. So again, we use copy dot, and then dot referring to this folder where the Docker file is stored. Okay, so we're going to copy everything inside of dcelery. That's what we're saying. And then that's going to be copied over to /user/src/app/. Okay, so that's where everything is going to be copied across to. And then at the end here, we can just then specify the our entry point. I'm going to add that in capitals, entry point. And so we then just need to specify /user. Again, this is the directory src, where we're going to find this in app. And then we're going to find this because we've copied it across. We're going to find entry point.sh. And there we go. So that's going to be run every time the container starts. So to summarize, we've now created our first service, our Django service. We're going to define and create a new container. So we specified the container name, where we're going to find the Docker file to actually build what we want to be included inside of our container, as well as a copy of Linux. And then we'd define some other parameters to get the server started, as well as be able to access the server and passing in some environment variables for a little bit of security. Now, obviously, when we're building the image, we're going to need to specify how to set up Django. So we're going to copy across our project. And then we're going to, well, naturally, we're going to, first of all, pip install pip, or just upgrade pip, sorry. And then we're going to install the dependencies. Then we're going to run the dependencies to install them, sorry. And then we're going to go ahead and make sure that the project files are over and ready to run, as well as run any additional setup commands. So once that's done, we then can start the server and then set up the volumes and ports and so on, and everything should be running nicely. So let's now give this a go. Right, so first of all, actually, let me just update this. Oh, no, that did not work. So the command I used earlier to cmod, so add that in there. So the next command we're going to be utilizing, assuming you have installed Docker, of course, is going to be docker compose. So we're going to run docker compose, and then we're going to specify how to actually start or build our new image and container. So we're going to use up. Okay, so that is basically going to read now our docker compose file and set everything up. Now, I'm going to set everything up to kind of work in the background. So what's going to happen is it's going to start running Django, and that's going to be running in the background of our new container. So I specified D and then -- to build. So that's going to build. So what we're doing now is we are specifying the fact that we're going to build everything. To build a new image, build a new container, bring it up when it's all built, and then run Django in the background. Right, so that's build, and I think we are done. So let's give that a go. Right, so that did not work at all. So let's have a look. Additional property service is not allowed. So that is indicating the fact that the indentations are incorrectly described or defined. So that's our doc compose file. Yeah. So root, something about, apologies, trying to close the terminal. There we go. So something about root. So service, let's just have a look. My apologies. So it should be services. So services. So let's give that a go again. And this time we're ready to go. So what's happening now then is that we are downloading a copy of that image that we've described, the copy of Linux that we have indicated in our Docker file here, Alpine. And it's going to go ahead, set up all these environment variables. You can see that the container has started. And so we should now be able to go back into Docker. And you can now see that we have our image that we created and the container. Now notice I called my container Django. That's what you can see here. So the name of my container is Django. So you can see the ports it's mapped to. So what I can now do is open up my browser in my local machine. Well, in actual fact, I can't do that because you can see here that it says it's exited. Okay, so it's tried to start the container, but there's an error. So all I need to do is click on the container. This is important because you will no doubt have an error at some point. So if I click on the container, we're then provided logs of what happened. You can see down here, we're told that the entry point line 6, potentially there is a problem. Now, if we go back into the entry point code here, the problem is here that we didn't add a space. So we are going to need a space there. That's it. That's all that the problem was. So we'll just go ahead. Now we can run the same command again, docker compose up build. So that should rebuild everything. And we should now be able to go into Docker and you can see it's all green. It's running. The status here is running. So everything is good to go. So let's go back into our browser and let's refresh. You can now see that we have successfully installed and we're running Django from the Docker container. Don't forget that we are using port 8001. So make sure you type that in. You probably cannot see that. So let me see if I can just bring that down slightly. I don't know if you can see that, but this is the domain. If you're not familiar with that, 127.0.0.1, 8001. If you're not too sure, you can simply just go into the Docker container here and it will tell you where to find, in this case, it doesn't really give you much information, but it tells you the port number that's running in the container. So just make sure that you are typing in 127.0.0.1 colon 8001. So that is Django set up in Docker at this point. If you aren't familiar with Docker and Django, then do just have a play around with those commands, just very briefly. If you are having any problems, sometimes it's good just to start again. Now, there is a command where you can just delete everything, but what you might want to do is just go ahead and delete all the containers. We will do it many times, and then all the images, and then just try again. Okay, so sometimes that's the best solution when retrying some different code options, just to delete everything and start again and run the command. Now, if you are having any problems at all, then please leave a comment in the Q&A and we will no doubt get back to you and help you. If we don't get back, hopefully someone else potentially will also help you. If there are any problems or any issues with the code base, then please let me know. I would definitely want to make those changes to make it easier for everyone to be able to follow along. And then also don't forget all the commands that we've utilized so far. And from this point onwards, we'll be in the command file here and you will find this document as well as all the other code here in the course lesson resources.